Good evening, everyone. I was asked to introduce the players and the theme tonight. My name is Jean-François, and I'm the Associate Provost for Research Advancement and Compliance here at Loyola Marymount University. And I'll be brief. Let's talk a little bit about how this got here. This being the artwork, the exhibit. I was in my office and Stephanie came by and said, there's this artist you have to see. Our ideas of having interdisciplinary triggers would be art in one fashion, and this is the guy who can do it. We're going to drive somewhere in California. Remember, I moved here 4 years ago from the East Coast. I had no idea where I was going. I got in a van, and I think it's a Cub Scout van or something, and I buckled in, and, we drove, and we went to see the exhibit, and as soon as I saw the exhibit, I was in love with it. All right.
Just make sure the door wasn't locked.
As soon as I saw the exhibit, I was in love with it. And when I met Jean-François, I wasn't in love with him, but I was certainly in love with his work. It triggered a lot of emotion, and being a frustrated artist myself, I'm an economist. It made a lot of sense. So Stephanie is the reason why this art show is here. On behalf of Loyola Marymount University, we want to welcome you all. We want to welcome the exhibit. We want to use it as a way to stimulate discussion around interdisciplinarity, and I think you're going to have a good time. And now Stephanie will come here. That's Jean-François. This is Stephanie. And she'll do all that. Have a good time. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. It has been a long journey to bring this exhibit here. When I first saw it at Cuesta College, I said, oh my gosh, this is it. This is mechanical, and it's multimedia, and it's hypertext, and it's all this rolled together. What a great forum for talking about interdisciplinary studies. It'll get everyone excited. That was my thought for it. So before we begin, I'd like to thank some people who really made this possible, because I've been trying to do this for, a year and a half or 2 years. And we finally made it happen. I would like to thank John Corpora, who spoke, the Associate Provost for Research Advancement and Compliance. He's always been a big supporter of this effort. And I'd like to thank Eric Strauss in the back. He's the director for the Center of Urban Resilience, which is a new, very interdisciplinary program on campus. And Dean Brian Alexander from College of Communication and Fine Arts is also a supporter, and then the College of where's my college? Frank R. Seaver College of Science and Engineering was also supported it in my department, and then School of Education, Dean Shane Martin was a supporter, and Hannon Library has always been an ardent supporter. Both Chris Brancolini was very enthusiastic about this, and Jamie Haslett has been totally amazing in bringing all of this together. So I really want to thank, especially Jamie, for making this happen. She deserves to be doing it. She's in the back, sitting very quietly. So I've known Colin actually since, I think he said 1977 he started working for my brother. My brother working for on an electronic music magazine called Synapse. I remember they were living in this, at least working in a house that was all black inside. It was very strange. But they did very creative things. And I've known Jean-François since forever.
Just about.
Yeah, for a long time. So I've always been fans of what they're doing. So I'd like to introduce the two of them, and then I'll turn the floor over to Colin, who will take it from there. So Colin Gardner is a professor of integrative studies and critical theory at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He works at the intersection of film philosophy, interdisciplinary media theory, and the Lewis studies. He earned his Master of Arts in History from St. John's College, Cambridge, and a PhD in Cinema Studies at UCLA before becoming a professor of critical theory and integrative studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he teaches in the departments of art, film and media studies, comparative literature, and the history of art and architecture. He's well published and has very broad interests. And it's just really fascinating to see how he takes linguistics and history and literature and sees art and sculpture in them. It's very fascinating. And Jean-François Podevin is a conceptual artist who grew up in France and now lives in California. His fascination with time, memory, and he's fascinated with time, memory, and the human psyche. As an illustrator and a designer, Podevin's work spans over 25 years and includes clients such as Time Magazine, The Washington Post, New York Times, Coca-Cola, Geffen Records, and Scientific American. And once you look at his work, you will begin noticing when you pick up an issue of Omni Magazine or AI Magazine, you say, oh, I recognize that. Because you've seen his work before, I'm sure. So I would like to thank you all for coming, and at this point, I will turn the meeting over to Colin. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to dedicate tonight's talk to Stephanie's dear brother, Chris, who was really responsible for us meeting and also me meeting Jean-François, who I used to see at Synapse magazine when he'd come by with his illustrations. He designed a great poster for the magazine that was a huge success. And I think it's also an apt dedication because Chris himself, as an artist, was an amazing interdisciplinary force, bringing together his study of Ishii, the last Chumash, who was a permanent exhibit at the Berkeley Museum in the last years of his life, which Chris presented as a digital installation, bringing together modern technology in order to explore the kind of objectification of this poor man. It was a really phenomenal piece of work. So there's a lot of Chris resonating through a lot of my ideas tonight, which I think is very apt. What I wanted to do tonight, in a way, was to use Jean-François' work as an example of interdisciplinarity to show the intersection of certain theoretical approaches. And I'm going to try and use it as an intersection of structural linguistics, particularly the work of Roman Jakobson, who was a Russian formalist, later founded the Czech school of structuralism in the 1930s. Roland Barthes, who many of you have probably read through Camera Lucida and Mythologies in particular. Marcel Proust, whose use of memory, of course, is absolutely crucial to the recherche. And last but not least, my two boys, Deleuze and Guattari, who I usually manage to shoehorn into every discussion I ever do, largely because I have tons of their quotes in the computer just begging to be used. So hopefully I think we will see how Jean-François' work lends itself well to this kind of interdisciplinarity. Of course, there are kinds of artwork that don't lend themselves to things like this, and it's the kind of artwork that really defies your ability to even write about it, let alone theorize it through different disciplines. I'm thinking in particular of someone like Tom Woodall, who was an LA painter and collage artist, who I once went up to and said, Tom, you know, I really like your work, but I've never written about it, because frankly, I wouldn't know where to begin. I have no clue as to how to frame the work intellectually. I don't know how to write about it. And I said, and so I haven't written about you, not because I don't like it, but it's just hopeless. And he turned to me and he said, you know, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said. And I could see his point, because certain artists are very concerned about the fact that the work shouldn't be translated into discourse. It should become more of a kind of felt, affective force. But then there's other kinds of work, and I'm not saying one's better than the other, that absolutely cries out to be written about because it allows the writer to show off to a certain degree. But it also becomes a catalyst for a lot of creative work through the hybridization of certain disciplines, where you can, in many ways, open up a whole new way, not only of looking at that particular body of work, but art in general. And I think Jean-François' work lends itself very well to that, as I hope to prove tonight. So I'm going to talk about it first, and then I'm going to introduce Jean-François, who will talk about it more subjectively, and then we'll open it up to questions for the two of us. So that's the plan. So what I wanted to start with is an analysis of the work from a structuralist perspective, which I think fits the work perfectly. And I have an illustration. How can we get the...
Just jump up and hit the space bar.
Just hit the space bar? Great. Okay. I've got a little diagram in the upper left corner of the screen there, which is actually a diagram of Roman Jakobson's structural linguistic system, which is inherited to some degree from the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, the founder of structural linguistics, who was the first to develop the whole concept of semiology, the study of signs and language and images as a sign system, where meaning can only be generated through the relational aspects of how one sign comes into contact with another sign. That it cannot generate meaning by itself. It has to be part of a system of relations. Jakobson extended this idea into a broader study of language, not just as individual signs, but how they can be collectivized into sentences, paragraphs, and larger structures in general. And he's known mostly for this diagram of the vertical and horizontal axes and their intersection. And the vertical axis is the axis of selection. And you can see already, really, how it's going to apply to Jean-François stochasticons, because each belt, by turning the handle, gives you a new selection of an image to look at, in much the same way that the vertical axis of Jakobson's system does in language. This is the axis of metaphor and the axis of paradigm. So if we were to take a simple sentence, like the cat sat on the mat, in terms then of a structure, the structure would remain the same if we replaced cat with dog, sat with ran, and mat with street. Nothing really changes, except we've changed it through the axis of selection. Dog has replaced cat, the verb has changed. In other words, the subject-predicate is the coherent part of the structure, but through different choices of selection, we've got the same structure that can then be applied to any scenario you want. The man went down the elevator into the lobby. Same structure. So in a sense then, when we start to look at Jean-François' work, we can change the image through this axis of selection accordingly. But at the same time, of course, they are also strung across the structure of the apparatus as a series of narrative combinations. That's the horizontal axis. That's the axis of combination, where the cat sat on the mat is not just a series of selections of images and words. It's also a string of words that could be added to. The cat sat on the mat, then it went to sleep, then it got up to eat, licked itself, went to bed, sat on the mat again. Typical cat existence. And in effect, you've got an infinite possibility of combination, and as long as you want to keep continuing it. And that's pretty much the way language always works. Jean-François has kind of cut off the possibilities in his work by limiting it to 4, but you can keep changing the selection to get another possible infinite number of narrative combinations. So what I'm trying to argue here, in a way, then, is that the very structural methodology of the machines themselves are exactly the same as that of language, and particularly Jakobson's system. Roland Barthes picked up on this in the 1960s and applied it to the same way that Jean-François does to more cultural manifestations. For example, the fashion system was one of Barthes' favorites, where, for example, the axis of selection could be a type of hat you might wear. So you could have a pillbox, leopard skin pillbox hat, a la Bob Dylan, or you could have a cowboy hat, or you could have a Homburg. They're all types of hats. but they're not the same type of hat. In other words, you could select a different one, right? Similarly, you could select different tops. You could have a blouse, a shirt, a jumper, or whatever. Different kinds of pants, short, long, whatever, flared, drain pipe. And then, I'm trying to do justice to the fashion part of it. And then shoes. They could be high heels, stilettos, they could be flats, they could be winkle pickers, they could be chiseled, and so on and so forth. But they're all types of shoe. So although they're part of the axis of selection, the whole ensemble of the outfit is like the horizontal axis. You've got what you wear on your head, what you wear on the top, what you wear at the bottom, and then what you wear at your feet. It's the same structural system. So we could start to see Jean-François' work then as similar then to Barth's idea of how language can work structurally. We've got the idea of how certain images can resonate across and between each other depending on what they conjure up in your head. Maybe like a painting that they remind you of, a Rembrandt, a Vermeer. And then you start to think of all the paintings that you've seen, and then it suddenly becomes an art history lesson. So the fashion system segues into an art history system. Bart also came up with another analogy, which is that of the restaurant menu. So you've got, for example, the selection axis, which is what do you eat as an hors d'oeuvre, what do you eat as the entree, what do you eat as the dessert, and what wine do you have with it, and what kind of after-dinner beverage do you finish it off with, right? So you could have, your meat entree, your fish entree, or a salad as an entree, as a process of selection. But the equivalent of the fashion ensemble then would be the whole meal. Maybe you might skip a course, so that might be a variation on it. But again, you can see how it all fits a relational structural system that you can apply to practically anything. And if you think about it, almost every movie you see is structured in exactly the same way also. And it's no accident that Jean-François' work, when you look at it horizontally, resembles a storyboard. Not only in the way it's styled and designed, but in how it evokes editing and montage. I was talking earlier about the Kuleshov experiment, which was developed by a Russian director in the 1920s called Kuleshov, who was trying to demonstrate how, in effect, actors are worthless. Because he was dealing with something of a prima donna actor who wanted, very Stanislavski style, who wanted to get in touch with his deep emotions in order to convey what he was trying to convey. And the Kuleshov experiment was designed to say, it doesn't matter what you're thinking inside, it's how I edit it that counts. So he said, just stand there and stare into space. And he said, okay, are you done yet? And he said, no, just keep staring into space. Okay. What am I supposed to be thinking about? It doesn't matter, just stare into space. So then he takes him staring into space for about 3 seconds, cuts in a 5-second shot of a sandwich, and then cuts back to the actor staring into space. And the actor could be thinking about anything, but in the process of editing it together, he's now hungry, right? And it's the system and the structure of the system that gives it that meaning. Nothing intrinsic to the image itself. So again, when we apply that to Jean-François' work, he may have been thinking about something specific in generating a particular image, but it's only in how it is presented as part of the relational system that it creates meaning for the spectator. And of course, we bring all of our collective baggage to bear on it as well, to transform it even further. So right from the get-go, it struck me that Jean-François' work was a major paradigm, if you like, if you want to apply the vertical axis again, to how structural linguistics works, but also works as an artwork where it's not pinned down to something as banal as the cat sat on the mat. It's more of a profound cinematic kind of language and editing closer to the Kuleshov experiment, where you feel this man's hunger, even though he's not acting hungry. It's the process that's making him hungry, in other words. It's not that far of a leap to extend this linguistic structure to a more psychological ramification, where we can bring in Freud in particular, also Jacques Lacan, who is an application of Freud to structural linguistics through his statement that the unconscious is structured like a language, because the unconscious is formed by language for Lacan. We're not born with an unconscious. In fact, the unconscious develops in and through our entering into language, what he calls the symbolic, and it takes on the characteristics of Jakobson's two axes. But instead of the paradigm and metaphor axis, the vertical axis, for Freud and Lacan, it's an axis of condensation. And the horizontal axis, instead of being that of metonym or syntagm in language, is that of displacement in psychoanalytic terms. And it's the intersection of those two axes that constitute the structure of what Freud calls the dream work. In other words, dreams are a manifestation of this language structure. And the dream work works through condensation and displacement. And this is appropriate to Jean-François' method, because Jean-François predominantly works in this series through images rather than words. Yes, there are some words in there. But in a way, he translates the words as much into images as anything else. And part of the difficulty of interpreting dreams for Freud is to try and decipher how and why it's working as an image and not just simply as language. And what does that image mean? Well, part of the way that you analyze the dream work is to find out what the core of the dream is, its latent content, by seeing how it's been distorted through condensation and displacement, through these language methods. So that, for example, if the dream is about fear of your father, in terms of condensation, the father may be condensed into one singular form in the dream. But at the same time, that father may be disguised by being dispersed and displaced throughout the dream into stand-ins for the father figure, like teachers, common one, any authority figures. You may have a dream about being pulled over by the cops for speeding, but it could really be about your Oedipal relationship to your father. This is a banal interpretation. Or you could be having a dream about a football game where you've got 11 fathers on the field at once, and they're all kind of tripping over each other trying to take the dominant role. And so that's another case of displacement. And you could argue then that Jean-François' work, if you wanted to analyze it through a Freudian framework, then is using these images in a similar way. So by turning the handle, you're creating different forms of condensation and creating new strings of images. You're creating new forms of displacement. It's no accident also that Jean-François sees these works as types of machine. And Freud and his contemporary Henri Bergson also saw the structure of the mind as an apparatus, a machinic apparatus, a sensory motor apparatus, in fact. In more simple terms, it's an input-output machine. The whole body is an input-output machine made up of images. Perceptions, then, for someone like Henri Bergson, are an infinite aggregate of images, but through which each body, through a process of selection, through perception, chooses the images they need for their immediate needs. So, for example, if I'm going to pick up this bottle of water, you're all sitting there, I'm shaking that and I'm looking for a target, I'm going to fling it across the room at somebody. Out of all of the aggregate of images that will be racing through your mind in the split second that it's flying across the room, it's very unlikely that you're going to be going, I'm thirsty, I'd like to get a bit of that. In other words, the self-protection image will rise up from your memory banks, and your automatic motor response will be to duck. Right? Same when you're crossing the street. You don't just stand there and admire the bodywork of that Mustang coming at you at 40 miles an hour. You get out of the way. Right? So in that respect, then, images, as part of this bigger machine, are always a paring down process from an infinite aggregate of possibilities to the one that suit your needs at the given moment. And Jean-François' work, again, is playing around with that concept that as the manipulator of these images, through selection and creating new strings of possibilities, you are, with his help, because he's pre-selected many of these images for you, you're creating new possible aggregates out of your immediate needs as the spectator and user of the work. So you see one image, it then triggers the possibility of finding another one that could go with it, and then all of a sudden you're generating a narrative as you go along in accordance with your needs. You might go, oh, that reminds me of a room I grew up in as a child. Oh, this one looks like my grandmother's room, and so you put the two together. And all of a sudden, you've got a memory trace in accordance with a kind of desire based on childhood memories, which is exactly how the Bergson Freudian machine works. So already, just using language, we have an intersection then, an interdisciplinary intersection of structural linguistics, psychoanalytic theory, and also Bergson's conception of the image, which is, of course, also apropos to an understanding of the cinema. Every film director and every editor has the opportunity of selecting from a potential infinity of images too, but they select the ones they want to select to tell the story they need to tell. They also have the opportunity to leave out images if they need to, simply because your ability, and Jean-François again plays on this, to be able to make connections, to jump across gaps, is so well developed, you don't need all the information. Classic example would be if you're watching a film and someone puts on their hat and coat, goes out the door, then you cut to them emerging in the street, and then you cut to them in the back of a taxi. The director doesn't need to show them getting into the elevator, going down the elevator, going through the lobby, waiting for the cab, hailing the cab. I mean, certain kinds of directors like to show that because they like to undo the conventions of cinema. But more often than not, they leave that stuff out because you're able to fill in the gaps yourself, because you're driven by a need for motor continuity. So even faced with Jean-François' deliberate fragmentation of the work and the image, you are searching for connections almost as a matter of course, because A, you desire them, and B, it gives meaning to your application of the memory image to, in many ways, your own personal history. I put up a couple of examples of a row of images to show how this works in a specific instance in the work. And the example I picked is instead of 4 images in the bottom left, is the one I'm going to talk about first. You might not be able to see them because they're kind of small, but the one on the far left is 3 pairs of naked women's legs protruding from the ocean between a couple of semi-anthropomorphic rocks. They look like synchronized swimmers training. Or Esther Williams, between takes. And then the second image is 3 abstracted pictures of women in 3 identical windows. So we've got a trio theme already. The third one is a Madonna and Child between two vertical color hue strips. It's called The Many-Colored Child. And again, it forms a kind of triptych. So the three theme is continuing. So we're already onto something here, simply in the formal construction of it. And then the final image is a kind of ghostly Madonna and Child in the center of a couple of intersecting circles over a kind of meshy background. Well, if we were to follow a kind of filmic logic, and we're obviously going to try and find meaning in this, we might think, well, there's a sort of progression here from a kind of pagan imagery, Aphrodite's birth from the ocean, and Aphrodite splintered into a multiplicity of forms where she may represent all women, let us say, to the introduction of a Christian mono-symbol of womanhood in the form of the Madonna. So we've got a shift now from pagan to Christian to a more abstracted version of love and women representing perhaps nurture. In other words, 3 or 4 different representations of women within the different history of civilization. I mean, that's sort of like a rough series of associations you could make. Now, you could take the same 3 images, but just change the 4th, like in the top right row, and instead of the heart with the women figures as the 4th image, we've got a Coke bottle. With, I think, the text, that obscure object of desire. And just by changing that one area of selection, it changes the whole tenor of the narrative flow of continuity. All of a sudden, it kind of looks like an image you might see in a Warhol silkscreen. All of a sudden, it's now part of the imagistic language of pop art and mechanical reproduction. We then start to go backwards over the other 3 images, and they no longer seem to be about paganism and Christianity. They seem to be about different objectifications of women. We now start to see the women's legs as an object of desire, as a commodity fetish, perhaps. I'm not saying any of this is written in stone. I'm kind of free associating here. And then the color hues either side of the Madonna suggest a different kind of mechanical reproduction, a shift in the plate of the silk screen, like Warhol's multiple Elvises and Marilyns, let us say. We start to realize that this object of desire is not obscure. It's available to everybody. I mean, it's just a consumer durable throughout the string of images, just by changing one of them. And it reminds me of this great Warhol quote about Cokes, Coca-Cola, where he said, "A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same, and all the Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it." All the images are good. All images of women are good, because they're all about desire, and they're all about their availability. It's about a kind of equalization of these images as commodities, all by changing one in a row. And again, you're free and open to make your own change. That's just mine. But you can see that the system that Jean-François is playing into is a very loaded one, because these images come with a lot of baggage, whether they are religious, gender-oriented, about commodity. I mean, there's a sort of Marxist subtext in the thing I just gave you, because I like to throw that in. And you'll find that similar things are going on in almost all of the stochasticon images, because they come not only out of Jean-François' personal memory, but also out of a collective memory that he has developed by looking at television, going to films, looking at magazines. So even an image that is ostensibly that of his, say, grandmother may well also be inflected and colored by another image that he's seeing. In other words, none of these images are pure. They're all composite in some way, shape, or form. And as a result of that, they are always culturally constructed in some way, shape, or form as well. What this then means is that this series of works, I think, also have certain relevance to Proust, because Proust's work, of course, is very much about different kinds of memory. I'll just take a little water.
Don't
throw.
And of course, as we all know, the recherche is about two different types of memory. Voluntary memory, where you make a conscious attempt to dredge up an image or a event from the past, drag it up into the present, and present it in as an authentic way as possible so that it resembles its past happening as closely as possible. If anyone has ever read Samuel Beckett, and I've spent 3-4 years reading pretty much everything, he wrote a really good book on Proust when he was about 25, very young, and he referred to voluntary memory as the dead hand of memory, as the most deadly thing you could possibly have and the most uncreative form of memory. Because it didn't make any attempt to transform a memory and make it useful for the present or even for the future. In other words, it's not like this Bergsonian idea of pulling up a memory image for a present need and a present action and running with it and take it from there and maybe even transforming the memory. It just preserves it like it's mummified or set in amber. This is ironic in a way because Beckett's estate, which is led by his nephew, Edward, are trying to set Beckett's entire oeuvre in amber, imposing the dead hand on it by rejecting any interesting form of interpretation of his plays. So you can't cast a woman in Waiting for the Dawn, for example. So it's very ironic that it's totally counter to everything Beckett stood for. The other kind of memory, of course, is involuntary memory, which is the famous scene triggered by him biting into the Madeleine after he's dipped it in tea, and he's transported immediately back to his aunt's kitchen when he did the same, and could even taste the original Madeleine in his mouth in the present. And what that does is unleash an unstoppable flow of memories about his childhood in Cambrai, and it would seem on the surface that this is a far more creative kind of memory, and maybe a memory that Jean-François' work is also trying to encourage in the viewer. You see something that might have been memorable for Jean-François, it triggers something in you, you leave his piece behind, and you're then suddenly in your own past as a result of the catalyst of that particular image. But Deleuze, for example, when he writes about Proust, says that both kinds of memory are equally problematic. One is the dead hand, because it just mummifies the past. But involuntary memory is bad because you can't control it. Because the whole objective is to turn it into art and to transform these memories into something new and relevant for the future. That's why when you read Proust, just as when you look at Jean-François' Machines, the book that Proust will eventually write when he discovers that writing will be his métier at the end of a recherche isn't the book that you've just read, which a lot of people think. Because all that does is fold the past into the present in an endless loop. It cannot be. The book has to be an apprenticeship for a book yet to be written in order for it to get out of the stranglehold of time. Just as Jean-François' work is faced with a kind of similar problem, which I think it overcomes via you, the spectator. You're the one who breaks the loop because you bring your own overlay into the work so that it becomes multi-layered in terms of different kinds of memories that you bring to bear. So you don't really get locked into voluntary or involuntary memory either. You become an artist in the very act of working with the work and transforming it. And the key to this, of course, is that Proust's recherche is not a pure memory on any level anyway, just like Jean-François' images are never a pure image. The recherche is a composite of memories that defy easy mapping. And Jean-François has a story that he told me about a memory that he had back in France. I think it's by a lake at sunset, and he's with his family. And it's a very vivid memory, and it takes him back into his childhood after he moved to California. And then when he started telling that memory to his family members who were supposed to be present, they all had a completely different memory of it. And they all said that it all happened on a different occasion. So what Jean-François had done, in a way, was himself create a composite. He'd done a Proustian act as an artist in bringing this composite memory together to produce something that didn't exist but could have existed. And it now exists purely as art. And this is the kind of memory, I think, that this work is really producing. And it's something that's better described, I think, as what Deleuze and Guattari call a monument. And when they talk about a monument, they don't really mean what we think of monuments when we think of something in a town square, of a famous personage, like Winston Churchill or something, that recreates a past time when the country was better and greater, and it's now gone, and we can always relive the memories. But again, this is a kind of past set in amber, set in stone. It's not living and breathing. The kind of monument Deleuze and Guattari are talking about is a monument that's always forward-looking. And it's a monument that always links up with other memories that constantly transform it. Just like you turn that handle, you create, literally, a new monument each time. This is how they describe it. I think it's great. It's true that every work of art is a monument, but here the monument is not something commemorating a past. It's a block of present sensation that owe their preservation only to themselves and that provide the event with the compound that celebrates it. The monument's action is not memory, but fabulation. And I think this term fabulation is one to carry home with you. It's a really good word, because it's derived from the idea of fabula, which is a story. But it's not simply the telling of a story that doesn't change. Fabulation is a tapping into different sensations that these memories generate. And what these fabulations do is that they isolate these sensations from their original context, sort of cut them out like bits of film, rearrange them and rejuxtapose them with other fragments to create new fabulations at each turn. Again, like turning the handles on the stochasticons. So this is, I think, where we get out of the Proustian stranglehold, because we can reinterpret Proust on these lines as a creator of monuments. But I think this work demonstrates it in material terms, maybe better than the novel even, because it gets you working with the image and you working on the image in a very, very powerful and creative way. So that way, you, the audience, are as much the producer of meaning as Jean-François is. He has no control over what you bring to the table, even though he may be the instigator of it. So what I've sort of done is kind of taken his authorial role out of the work. So what I'll do now is introduce Jean-François and put it all back.
I'm going to try to do that now.
Yes, yeah, reclaim.
Well, as you said earlier, I was going to bring a more subjective aspect of my own work here. And let's let's see. When I were you going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's all yours now.
Yes. When I first came to the United States, it was about 30 years ago. I went to school here for a year, and I went back to France and finished school, and came back and moved and immigrated to the United States. And I was married in France with a girl from California, and we have 2 children. But anyway, when I moved to the United States, I felt an incredible change of my identity. You know, I didn't have my school friends anymore. Everything that pertained to every aspect of my life was different. And somehow I decided, maybe involuntarily, to start fresh with life in a way. So I had no political ideas, no beliefs, no system of beliefs. I just decided, well, I'm a fresh human being there in the United States of all countries, which is a good one to do that kind of things. Doing that, I began to recapitulate about my life, and try to make sense, recreate my identity in a way. And I began to write journals very early, 30 years ago. I wrote journals every day, and they were half visuals, half written journals. My profession is that of an illustrator, a graphic designer and illustrator. I make a little parenthesis here. I work mostly in editorial. The last 20 years, that's all I've done, editorial work for magazines. In doing so, across the years, I had to change. I use incredible array of techniques, you know, from drawing, oil painting, acrylic paintings, collage, copy camera collage, and photography. On photography with photocopy, and then the computer came, and then that changed, and it evolved every year. Anyway, so early on, my attitude was to use anything to make an image. It was half written, half visual journals. They had no chronological order. That's, in other words, I would start on a journal, and all of a sudden I would put it away and go back to it a year later. And I just make a reference to where I stopped the last time. So now, 30 years later, I have about 200 of these journals. There are a few of them displayed here. And they create this whole sort of visual expression, which I started 7 years ago when I made a clean slate. I decided to sort of be my own scientific experiment, so to say. You know. And so I never thought of myself, except that I was an illustrator, as an artist, because that work was so personal. And I was really looking for the essence of things, the essence of time, the essence of the past, of memory, to this day, up until today. Very often it's a very emotional journey, you know. And at one point, it's interesting. I'm being very subjective here. I mean, almost like talking from the. I mentioned the element of time. Recently, I realized that time is like paint for me. It's like it's a media that I use. I do things in time. The sketches, like the ones you have in the banners in one of the corridors, are done in time. They are like a small dance or something like that. They have to be done. You know, they're no reflection. It's just take the brush, and just like a Zen moment or something like that. But it's very important, the knowledge of doing things in time like that. Going back to this huge blob of sketchbooks, really, which is what they are, I came to a point in which I said, what is this? You know, what is this thing? I can make it into a book. I can't make it into a movie. I can't make it into and somehow I came to a time where I had to express, to materialize something. And that's where I came up with the idea of this body of work, composite memory, and decided to make like a more constructed body of work. Also, one of the main motivations is that as you get older, you become conscious of your mortality. And if you're an artist, you somehow want to do something that will be left behind, or you're compelled to do that. So that's what I did, and it took me years to do. I saw it as it's a huge cycle when you think of it. The 7 machines are like a cycle of life, the cycle of a year. There are 365 images, 7 machines, like the 7 days of the week, 28 bells, like the moon in our calendar. And each machine has a theme. The first one is called Fiat Lux, like in the Bible, let there be light. And it's all about the theme of beginnings, creation. There are pictures of my children when they were born. Picture of myself when I was young. And then also my interpretation of myth of creation from different systems of belief, from theoretical physics to Christianity, to Hinduism or whatever. I'm fascinated by the multiplicity of ideas about something like the beginning, And in this body of work, there is a concept that I always bear in mind, is the idea of contradiction, of ambivalence. Talking about different ideas of creation, for instance, some ideas contradict the other. So some images complete each other, you will see. On some myths of creations, it can happen, Some might be even controversial. For instance, I asked the question, if one believes in God, did he go back to his original darkness after he created light? It's nobody wants to hear that, but but I want to raise the question, So anyway, this whole body of work, composite memories, just goes through 7 great themes. The first one, the number 1, creation. The second one is called Vesica Pisces, the belly of the fish. It's the intersection of two circles, and it creates this kind of fish-like shape. And the line between the two center of the circle is called the belly of the fish. It's really the logo of creation, of man and woman, of birth, it's the logo of duality. So the number 2 piece, Vesica Pisces, is about duality, about man and woman, about number 2. Number 3 is called, I'm not going to tell you every number, it's sort of a little bit self-described in the pieces themselves. But here I wanted to give you an overview of this. It's a complex project because it's, as Colin was saying earlier, it's movable, it's fluid. You cannot, I created a monster in a way because I created with my still images because of the context that I put it in. No, it will always escape me. And then you have access to it as much as I do, And the other machines that are displayed in the exhibits reflect a little bit similar ideas. I need a little sip of water here. I'm not going to go into details of them. You'll see my sketchbook, which is that kind of mass of information that I gathered over the years, from which I gleaned the material to make more focused, pieces. And when we go in the next room, the exhibition room there, I'd love for you to just crank the wheels and enjoy it, and ask me any question that if you wish. Any of the pictures in this 365 images in the main piece, composite memory, are in my eyes, a painting by themselves. But the fact I put them in machines, then I force them into a situation in which their meaning will change, as Colin so well explained earlier. So let's move to. I think we want to answer some questions. If you have some questions for Colin,
I have a question. How did you arrive at the name for your machine?
The composite numerals?
No, stochasticons.
Stochasticons. Well, stochasticons, well, actually, it came from my mentor, who is here, Colin Gardner, who was a teacher at Loyola Marymount a few years ago. He came to my studio, and somebody had mentioned to me, a friend of mine named Joe Flores had mentioned to me that these are stochastic machines. And I said, what is stochastic? What are stochastic machines? He said, well, they are machines that have infinite, it's a term used in economics, that have infinite possibilities and within finite real limits. So Colin came over and I told him about stochastics, and he said, well, you should call these stochasticons. So I give you credit for the work that you've done. And Colin has been a very strong influence on that. He's been working for years on a large body of work called visual logic, right?
Visual syntax.
Visual syntax, yes. It's a book that I use the principle of his books in my work a lot. It explains the power of the juxtaposition of images of two symbols, whether they're touching and whether they're remote, far away from each other, or superimposed. Imagine a man and a woman, And this is Colin has developed this really incredible observations on visual thinking with his book here. So it's a great influence in my work. All right, so did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I have a question for Colin. Could you bring up that screen again? See, I think you're missing another dimension there, because so you have the axis of selection and the axis of combination. If you think of those as your two inputs, and then your story is going to be your output, the dimension you're missing that you talked about Proust was the emotions. So because everything that your story that you're going to output or tell, it's going to be influenced not only by what you select, the order in which you pick it, but what you're feeling within yourself. So that's feedback for the linguistics to put that back in there. It's interdisciplinary.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, the question was about the fact that what's missing with the axes is the emotions are not there. In many ways, I think the emotions lie in what I was talking about as the gaps between things in the image. The cat sat on the mat is kind of banal, but if you say it the way a method actor would, like, the cat sat on the mat. I mean, the cat's now a jazz aficionado. He's a dude, right? And it's a nightclub. And this is, again, I think the emotion comes out, and I should probably have mentioned this, I think the emotion comes out from the connotative axis, not the denotative. A typical example of that, probably the best example of the difference, is the word bachelor. A bachelor denotes an unmarried man. That's all it is. That's all denotation is. What's a bachelor? An unmarried man. What does a bachelor connote? Oh, some guy who lives in the marina, has a Lamborghini, has parties every weekend, has got a great wardrobe, awesome record collection, right? And all of a sudden, you're into this whole emotive. It's all about sex and desire. That's the connotation of work. And the great thing about language is, of course, that you can take a word like cat, and it can mean a jazz hipster, but it could also be a cougar, a lion or a tiger, not just a domestic cat. It could also be a caterpillar track. truck on a building site. You know, the cat wrecked the house. Well, yeah, it could be a caterpillar tractor, right? That's where the emotive register comes into play, I think, in the kind of gaps between the possibilities of what words and images mean. So I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Unlike my colleague who wanted to bring us back to the intentional graphics, I'm wondering if there's a way for us to get to the unintentional graphics, the screensaver, that seem to sort of punctuate unintentionally punctuate varying parts of this presentation, right? In ways that these images, these sort of shaded Dune kind of images, shifting and moving, sort of both distracted us from elements of the presentation, but actually sort of drew us more deeply into many of the logics, you know, adding another dimension of our ways of thinking about these issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. The question was about the fact that screensaver popping in and interrupting things creates a whole other logic of narrative that's often unintended. And I think that's absolutely intrinsic to most experimental film, where they deliberately interrupt the seemingly logical, action-oriented sequence of events. I mean, really done by someone like Jean-Luc Godard, who, I use the example of somebody getting on their hat and coat and going out the door, then appearing in the street, and then in the back of a cab. With Godard, you cannot take it for granted that the person emerging in the street is doing it even the same year, let alone in the same sequence of events, or that the cab is in the same city. The guy who's the king of that was Dziga Vertov, who wrote a manifesto on the idea of keynote eye, which is an eye better than the human eye because it allowed you to do the very thing you're talking about. You can take the eyes of one man, the ears of another, the feet and legs of another, and edit them together to create a man you would never see in reality, but is a Superman for the new age. And I think the screensaver popping on like this is like this gap that we could all enter into as this new ideal. Great question.
I was interested in that word you used, fabulation, which I had never heard before. But it's very intriguing to me because if I understand it right, is it sort of making out of a memory, a sort of a dead memory dredged up from the past, and making kind of a fable out of it that then might be used in a creative way into the future, as maybe a novelist would take his childhood memory and then build a novel out of it, making it into a kind of a fable?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's talking about the use of the term fabulation and making a kind of new fable out of a dead memory. I was using it in the sense that Deleuze and Guattari talk about it in their book, What is Philosophy? And they talk about fabulation as creating a kind of fable, but that generates an audience that hasn't yet come into being, because this image, based on this dead memory and dredged up from it, is sort of not ready for prime time yet. It still needs an audience to kind of bring it to life, to create a community that can really appreciate it for what it is. The best example I can think of for something like that is Muhammad Ali when he opposed the Vietnam War and went from being a sporting hero and a boxer to an anti-war activist and a black Muslim who completely created a whole new audience for himself that never existed before when he resisted the draft. He fabulated himself into a new identity to create, say, somebody like me who loved him as a boxer but loved him even more as this new entity that I felt had never existed before, and love him to this day for it.
Yeah.
And it brings into being something that you can't conceive of at the time that you've had it as a memory, but in a way only becomes real after the fact when you're looking back at the moment of its birth.
And a poet or an author who kind of operates on that principle, wouldn't he be sort of at risk of having no readers in the present time, but maybe after he's dead sometime, and then he's get a few.
Yeah, and the question about the fact that an author is often out of his own time and ahead of his time, yeah, that is the risk, absolutely. And that is, in many ways, a testament to the fact that the world moves on to the point where the fabulation realizes itself. I mean, it ties in with that whole Hegelian idea of the owl of Minerva, that the philosopher only gets the key insight into something to the dead of night when the owl has already flown. I mean, it's sort of like the built-in contradiction of thought and of insight. And the idea of fabulation is a more Nietzschean one, because Deleuze and Guattari are very intrinsically Nietzschean, that you have to think like an artist, first and foremost. And the philosopher has to think like an artist, and has to think of ideas and concepts that answer questions that haven't even been raised yet. It's a difficult thing to get your mind around, because like Jean-François was saying, it's playing around with time of which you have no real handle. Good questions, though.
Two questions. This idea of fabulation, what role does that play in scientific discovery or in engineering? And then what do we need to be able to do to take that and turn it into a computational model so a computer can fill in that glue between the signs and make sense of things?
Yeah, well, I would say it would be absolutely intrinsic to, what Disney would call Imagineering, you know? Yeah. I mean, to give it a kind of pop culture spin, but I mean, real scientists are Imagineers. They ask questions that haven't been posed yet and come up with hypothetical answers that then lead them into realms of exploration that go simply beyond what if. I mean, Einstein must have done it with the theory of relativity in order to have discovered it in the first place, presumably, because you can't base it on an old model. So again, when Deleuze and Guattari in Buddhist philosophy ask these questions, they actually ask them on these different, what they call planes. There's the plane of the scientist that they call the plane of organization, and the plane of immanence, which is that of the philosopher, and the plane of composition, which is the plane of the artist and the poet. And they're not all mutually exclusive. And in fact, the true philosopher and the true scientists and the true artists find ways for those planes to intersect. And it's at those this is why it's so germane to this topic tonight of interdisciplinarity. It's their meeting ground where the most brilliant things happen. And I think that's where scientists have to operate.
Well, even Einstein couldn't deal with the issue of quantum mechanics.
No.
He just put up his hands and said, this isn't right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Colin.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I think that what's so remarkable about this man is his skill. Just his skill. It's almost impossible to imagine that you could give him any two images from any diverse directions and he couldn't hold them in together.
Yeah, Jean-François, you want to talk about some of your background and training and how you're such a brilliant draftsman? It's awesome.
Oh, thank you. Well, maybe I can connect a little bit with interdisciplinary studies, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for bringing this issue. I do use a lot of techniques on. There is a gentleman here behind the camera, a photographer, fine art photographer named Larry Shear, whom we met about 25 years ago. And this gentleman in 1980 was already in computer graphics. He knew all the pioneers of computer design, and somehow he really got me into it. So I've been using the digital media for 25 years, almost. Oh, I'm sorry, close to you. And thanks to Larry. I remember, well, this is an interdisciplinary phenomenon in a way. Me being a traditional artist doing oil paintings and meeting Larry Shea was telling me, well, you should do pictures that way. You know. And it took some convincing, I'm sure, at first. So the skills involved in the type of images I'm making, first of all, I'm influenced by other artists. My father was an artist, a painter, also abstract painter. You know, he did large oil paintings. Closest example I could think of is the artist Divencourt, maybe. And so he's a big influence on me. And then I was influenced by illustrators such as the illustrators who did the album covers, which were totally different techniques, and I was fascinated by both. And I somehow had to find a way to. Then I meet a gentleman like Colin, who altogether have a different idea of graphics and graphic design, coming from a totally different direction. And somehow I had to encompass that as well. Somehow I was sort of a huge sponge of technique. I was fascinated by that, and I felt compelled to meet the challenge of doing it. It was very appealing to me. Any technique is very appealing. Well, strangely enough, I find a lot of artists are masters in their own techniques, and they don't like to come out of it. I understand that. On the other hand, I always thought that I'm going to do this, paint this, or in 2 years I might be really bored with it, so I better start planning for the future. You know, that's a strong motivation as well. So along the way, I mean, I was interested in other techniques, and I did that through meeting other artists with a totally different approach about their work. So definitely artists in a way in different disciplines. When I incorporated photography into my work, it was a totally different way of thinking, you know. Colin, did I answer your question? More or less?
Yeah, it really wasn't a question, which I like to praise. I'm just saying.
Oh, well, it wasn't. Thank you. I should thank you.
You're really the only person I know who I could trust to either photograph something, collage it, or if nothing else was available, draw it. You know, I mean, not too many people, most people in this day and age do one or the other or something, but your skills are really admirable in the fact that you will it's almost like it's second nature to you how you do these things. You don't, it doesn't take you a lot of time to do these.
It's very obsessive compulsion. So thank you, Carl. It's really a wonderful thing to say.
So I think thirst has overtaken mental inquiry, so we should probably...
We can always talk out there.
We can talk out there. And I actually think talking to Jean-François while you're playing with the machines is really the way to go. So enjoy.
Thank you.